The screaming came first, a sound I'll never forget, like metal being torn apart by the gods themselves. I was in the barn that October morning, tending to the chickens, when the sky split open and a British Spitfire plummeted through the clouds, trailing smoke and fire. My hands froze mid-motion, a handful of grain suspended between my palm and the scattered flock. The plane didn't spiral gracefully or disappear beyond the horizon. It dropped like a stone into the forest behind our property, close enough that I felt the earth shudder beneath my boots, close enough that I could smell the burning fuel even from where I stood. My name is Margaret, though most people in the village called me Maggie, the farmer's daughter with too much spirit and not enough sense. I was 23 that morning, old enough to know danger when I heard it, young enough to believe I could do something about it. The war had been knocking on our French farmland for 4 years, and like everyone else, I'd learned to live with the percussion of distant bombs and the shadow of Nazi occupation. But this was different. This was immediate. This was personal. This was mine to choose. I dropped the grain bucket and ran toward the tree line, my skirts tangling around my legs, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Behind me, I could hear my mother shouting from the house, her voice swallowed by the wind and my own desperate breathing. The woods were dense, ancient oaks and pines, creating a cathedral of shadows. Smoke curled through the canopy in thick gray ribbons, and the smell of burning fuel choked my throat until I could barely breathe. My lungs burned, but I pushed forward anyway, drawn by something I couldn't name, duty perhaps, or the simple human instinct to help someone in need. When I found the wreckage, my stomach nearly gave out. The fuselage was twisted into something unrecognizable, flames still licking at the edges, consuming everything in their path. For a moment, I was certain no one could have survived such destruction. The plane had been torn apart by the impact, reduced to smoking rubble and shattered glass. But then I heard it, a groan, barely human, coming from beneath the twisted metal. The sound was weak, desperate, filled with agony that transcended language. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, I scrambled toward the burning metal. My hands were already blistering from the heat, but I barely felt the pain. He was pinned beneath the canopy, blood streaming down his temple, his flight suit singed and torn. His eyes fluttered open when I touched his shoulder, and in that instant, something shifted in the universe. His gaze was blue, impossibly, achingly blue, and filled with a desperation that mirrored my own. He was no older than 25, with sharp features and the kind of beauty that seemed too delicate for a man. He looked like a fallen angel, and I was about to become either his savior or his executioner. "Can you move?" I asked, pulling at the twisted metal with all my strength. It wouldn't budge. My muscles screamed in protest. "I need to get you out of here. Please, you have to try." "Germans," he managed, his accent clipping the word short. His voice was rough, damaged. "They'll be searching. Saw me go down. Will come quickly." My mind raced through the possibilities like a bird trapped in a cage. The German patrol station was only 3 kilometers away. In the chaos of the crash, they would have heard the impact for certain. We had perhaps 10 minutes, maybe less, perhaps only 5. Every second that passed was a second closer to capture and execution. I made a decision in that moment that would unravel everything I knew about safety, loyalty, and who I was meant to be. A decision that would change the trajectory of my entire life. I used a charred piece of the fuselage as leverage, straining every muscle until my vision blurred at the edges. The pain in my hands was extraordinary, but adrenaline was a powerful drug. The canopy groaned and shifted just enough for him to squeeze through. He was heavier than he looked, his right leg clearly injured, possibly broken. I half-dragged, half-carried him deeper into the forest, away from the burning plane, my lungs burning as badly as the wreckage behind us. "What's your name?" I demanded, more to keep him conscious than from curiosity. Blood was running down his face, and I could feel his weight getting heavier with each step. "James," he gasped, his voice fading in and out like a radio losing signal. "James Whitmore, RAF, and you're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most insane." "Probably both," I said, pulling him forward with everything I had left. "My farm is just east of here, maybe a kilometer. We have a cellar. The Germans won't search there. They know my father died 2 years ago, that it's just me and my mother. They pity us, which is the only advantage I've ever had in this war." Behind us, I heard the first distant sounds of vehicles. They were coming, and we were running out of time. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. The back entrance to the farmhouse was hidden behind the overgrown vegetable garden my mother had abandoned after my father died. Most of it had withered into brown stalks and twisted vines, a physical manifestation of our collective grief and loss. It was the perfect cover, a shield of neglect that would work in our favor. James could barely walk now, and I was running on pure adrenaline and something else, something I didn't have a name for yet, but would come to understand as the recklessness of love, that dangerous emotion that makes people capable of extraordinary things. My mother was waiting in the kitchen when we stumbled inside, her face white as chalk, her hands trembling. She took in the scene, me covered in dirt and soot and blood that wasn't entirely my own, a half-conscious British pilot hanging from my shoulders, his uniform torn and stained with smoke, and her expression transformed from shock to something harder, more determined. She was a small woman, my mother, made smaller by loss and years of sacrifice, but in that moment, she was a lion prepared to defend her young. "The cellar," she said simply, already moving toward the wooden door that led beneath the house. Her voice was steady, brooking no argument. "How long do we have?" "I don't know," I admitted, struggling to keep James upright. "Minutes, maybe longer. The Germans will search methodically. I don't know how many teams are out there looking." She pulled back the heavy door, and I carefully maneuvered James down the narrow stone stairs that descended into darkness. Each step was an eternity. The cellar was cool and damp, lined with shelves of preserves we'd canned together through the summer, peaches and plums and berries preserved in glass jars. The smell of vinegar and fermentation filled my nostrils, a smell that would forever be associated with this moment. It wasn't much, this cellar, but it would have to be enough. It was all we had. I settled James onto a pile of old blankets in the corner, his breathing shallow, but steady. I arranged cushions beneath his head, trying to make him as comfortable as possible. Around us, the cellar seemed to hold its breath, as though the very earth understood the gravity of what was about to happen. "Don't move," I whispered, kneeling beside him. "Don't make a single sound. No matter what happens upstairs, no matter what you hear, voices, footsteps, searches, you stay silent. You don't move. You don't breathe loudly. Do you understand? Your life depends on this." He reached out with surprising strength and grabbed my wrist, his blue eyes fixing on mine with an intensity that took my breath away. "You'll be careful? They'll kill you if they find me. They'll shoot you both without hesitation. The Nazis don't show mercy for this kind of betrayal." "I know," I said. And I did know. I'd heard the stories. Everyone had. People disappeared. People were executed. But knowing and caring are two different things. And I cared deeply. I cared with the kind of intensity that terrifies and transforms, that rewrites your understanding of who you are and what you're capable of. But they won't find you. I promise you that. I pulled my hand away. Though it took more effort than it should have, my fingers reluctant to break contact, and climbed back up the cellar stairs just as I heard the sound of trucks grinding to a halt outside the house. Heavy vehicles, military vehicles. My blood turned to ice, boots. Heavy, determined boots on the gravel. Soldiers. Multiple soldiers from the sound of it. My mother was already at the door, her cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked every bit the grieving widow, fragile, harmless, and entirely above suspicion. She looked like someone incapable of harboring dangerous secrets. The German officer was tall and thin, with the kind of face that had been carved from disappointment and years of war. His eyes were cold, metallic, the eyes of someone who had spent so long being the predator that he'd forgotten what it meant to be human, what it meant to feel mercy. Behind him were two soldiers, rifles at the ready, fingers near triggers. This wasn't a courtesy call. This was an invasion, a domination. "We are searching for a British pilot," the officer said in French, accented by German gutturals. "His plane crashed in the forest." "You have not seen him?" My mother shook her head, her hands trembling just the right amount. The trembling of a frightened woman, not the trembling of someone harboring secrets. "We heard the crash. It frightened us terribly, but we have seen nothing. We stayed inside, as is safest." The officer's eyes moved past her, scanning the interior of the house with clinical precision. For a moment that stretched like taffy. I thought he would demand to search the entire property. I thought we would fail before we'd even begun. But then something shifted in his expression. A flicker of disdain, perhaps, or the kind of prejudice that made him believe no woman would be intelligent or brave enough to harbor an enemy of the Reich. He had underestimated the power of his own assumptions, and in doing so, he had already lost. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice filled with authority and menace. "If you see anything, report to the station immediately. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," my mother said softly, her voice perfectly modulated. "Thank you, sir. We will be careful." They searched the property for 2 hours. I could hear them moving through the barn, overturning hay, calling to each other in German. My heart was in my throat the entire time. My hands clenched so tightly that I left marks in my palms, blood pooling beneath my fingernails. Every sound felt like a death knell. Every moment stretched into an eternity of waiting and terror. But the cellar remained untouched. The officer never asked about it. Perhaps he assumed it was too obvious a hiding place. Or perhaps he simply didn't believe we had the courage to attempt something so dangerous. Either way, when the trucks finally rumbled away into the distance, fading until the sound was completely gone, I realized I had been holding my breath for what felt like hours. I took a long, shaking breath and met my mother's eyes across the kitchen. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We both understood that everything had changed irrevocably the moment I'd pulled that British pilot from the wreckage. We were no longer neutral parties in this war. We were conspirators, and we would see this through to whatever end awaited us. Freedom or death, there would be no middle ground. For 3 days, James remained in the cellar, and the secret remained between my mother, myself, and the shadows that seemed to grow darker with each passing hour. I had to be careful about when I brought him food. A bowl of soup, some bread, a glass of water. The Germans maintained sporadic patrols, and any deviation from routine could invite suspicion. So I waited until evening when the light faded into that peculiar blue-gray that comes just before true darkness, and I would slip down the stairs with whatever provisions I could gather without raising questions. My mother and I developed a rhythm, a careful dance of normalcy that masked the extraordinary danger lurking beneath our floorboards. On the first night, I sat with him in the candlelight, and we spoke in whispers about things that seemed impossibly trivial given the circumstances. He told me about his childhood in Yorkshire, about his mother who loved to garden, about his younger sister who wanted to be a pilot herself. I told him about my father, about how he'd died not from the war, but from pneumonia that winter, how the grief had hollowed out something inside my mother that I feared could never be repaired. We were 2 people from different worlds, separated by nationality and circumstance, and yet in that cellar we felt like the only 2 people alive. On the second night, I found him fevered, his wound infected. The gash on his leg had turned an angry red, swollen and hot to the touch, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness, muttering things in English that I didn't quite understand, but that sounded like prayers mixed with regrets and fragmented memories. I knew I needed to help him, but I also knew that bringing a doctor into this would be impossible. No doctor in the village would keep such a secret. Fear ran too deep, and the occupiers had a way of making people choose compliance over compassion. They were masters of coercion, experts at turning neighbor against neighbor. So I became his doctor. I heated water on the stove in small batches, telling my mother it was for washing. I tore strips from an old sheet and fashioned bandages from materials we could afford to lose. I found a bottle of brandy in my father's study, a relic from before the war, from a time when people drank for pleasure rather than for numbness, and I cleaned the wound as best I could, watching James's face contort with pain even through his fever. He gripped my wrist as I worked, and I could feel the tremors running through him like current through a wire, the electricity of agony and infection burning through his body. "Margaret," he whispered, and my name sounded like a prayer on his lips, like a word that held the power to save him. "If I don't survive this, I need you to know. You're going to survive," I interrupted, my voice firmer than I felt. "You're going to live, and you're going to get back to England, and you're going to fly more missions, and you're going to survive this entire godforsaken war. I didn't pull you from that wreckage to let you die in my cellar. I didn't risk everything to watch you fade away in the dark." He managed a weak smile, his lips pale against his fevered skin. "Determined, aren't you?" "Stubborn," I corrected, meeting his eyes. My father used to say I had the stubbornness of a mule and the courage of a fool. Turns out he might have been right about one of those things. maybe both. By the third day, his fever had broken, though his leg was still badly compromised. We both knew he couldn't stay much longer. The Germans were growing more aggressive, more suspicious. They'd begun stopping farmers on the roads, asking questions, demanding papers, tightening their grip around the throat of the village like a noose. It was only a matter of time before they returned with more thorough intentions, before they decided to conduct a proper search of every property within a 5-kilometer radius. I sat beside him in the candlelight, my hand resting on his chest where I could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong. The cellar felt like a tomb, and maybe it was. A tomb for the people we used to be before the war made us into something more, or something less. The bombs had changed us. The occupation had changed us. But this moment, this man, had changed me most of all. "There's a resistance cell that operates in the forest," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know them, and they don't know me, but my father did before he died. He left me a name, an address in the village, a baker named Claude. I think if I can get you to him, he can get you to safety. He can get you back to England." "It's too dangerous," James said, but his eyes were already calculating, already planning. I could see his military mind working through the logistics, the risks, the possible outcomes. "If they catch you, they won't," I said, with a confidence I didn't entirely feel, but needed to project anyway. "And even if they do, I'd rather die knowing I tried than live, knowing I let you be recaptured. I'd rather be executed as a traitor than live as a coward." He reached out and took my face in his hands, his palms rough and warm against my cheeks. His touch was gentle, reverent, as though he was memorizing the feel of my skin. "You're extraordinary," he said, his blue eyes searching mine. "I hope you know that. In any other circumstance, in any other life, I would have pursued you relentlessly. I would have made you fall in love with me the way I'm already falling in love with you. I would have given you everything." My breath caught. I hadn't expected that confession, though perhaps I should have. Over 3 days, we'd moved beyond the boundaries of obligation into something that felt dangerously like destiny. He was the enemy, technically, a British soldier, an Allied pilot, everything the Nazis taught us to hate. And I was aiding him, harboring him, falling in love with him in a cellar beneath my farmhouse. The entire situation was madness wrapped in moonlight and desperation. "Maybe in another life," I said softly, tears streaming down my face unbidden. "You'll have that chance." He kissed me then, and it was the kind of kiss that changes everything. Urgent and tender simultaneously, tasting of desperation and hope and the terrible knowledge that this might be the last moment we would ever share. It was a kiss that sealed a promise neither of us could keep, but we made it anyway, binding ourselves to each other in the only way we had left. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet with tears that matched my own. "Thank you," he whispered against my skin. "For everything. For this. For me." The journey to Claude's bakery took me through the village square, past the spot where the German patrol had established their new headquarters just 2 weeks prior. My heart was in my throat, my hands clenched so tightly around the basket I was carrying that my nails left marks in the wicker. James was hidden in the back of our old farm cart, concealed beneath a false bottom my father had built decades ago for reasons I never quite understood. Perhaps he'd known that someday his daughter would need a way to move dangerous things undetected, would need a mechanism for survival. I'd dressed him in Claude's spare clothes that I'd retrieved earlier through careful intermediaries. The plan was simple, but fragile, like a house of cards that could collapse with the slightest disturbance. If the Germans stopped me, if they decided to search the cart, if anything went wrong, everything would unravel in seconds. But I couldn't think about failure. I could only think about James, about getting him to safety, about honoring the promise I'd made to myself and to him. The bakery smelled like heaven, fresh bread and butter and possibility and hope. It was a smell that seemed impossible in a world occupied by Nazis and death. Claude was behind the counter, a man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that nevertheless missed nothing. He was serving a German officer, handing him a fresh baguette with a smile of practiced submission. When he saw me enter, his entire body seemed to pause, as though he recognized something in my face that was familiar and dangerous in equal measure. I waited until the officer left, examining the display of bread and pastries with feigned casualness. My hands were shaking, but I forced them to stillness. I forced my face into a mask of normalcy. I'd become an actress in the span of 3 days, learning to hide my terror behind careful expressions and measured words. "Margaret," Claude said simply, dusting flour from his apron. His voice was warm, but his eyes were calculating, assessing. "You have your father's eyes. The same determination, the same impossible idealism that got him into trouble more than once." He paused, moving closer, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Is he still alive? Your father left instructions for a moment like this, told me to help his daughter if she ever came to me with a particular request. He died 2 years ago," I said carefully, glancing around the empty shop. A bell on the door would alert us if anyone entered. "But he left me something. A name. A promise to help if there was ever a need." Claude's expression shifted into something that looked like grief and pride combined, as though he was mourning my father even as he honored his legacy. "Your father was a good man, a brave man. It would honor his memory to finish what he started." He set down the bread he'd been holding and moved toward the back of his shop with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to making these kinds of movements. "How soon?" "Tonight," I said, my voice steady, despite the fear threatening to overwhelm me. "The longer he stays, the greater the risk to everyone." Claude nodded, disappearing into the back room. I was left alone with my racing thoughts and the smell of baking bread that suddenly felt like the smell of all the ordinary things I would never experience again. The smell of peace, of normalcy, of a world before war. I breathed it in deeply, trying to memorize it, knowing that everything was about to change irrevocably. When he returned, he had with him a man I'd never seen before, tall, dark-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to moving through danger with practiced efficiency. His eyes were cold and calculating, the eyes of a professional. "This is Michel," Claude explained quietly. "He's part of the network, part of the resistance. Tonight, your pilot will be moved to a safe house north of here, beyond the checkpoint. From there, the process to get him back to England will begin. It could take weeks. It could take months. There are no guarantees in this war, but he will get home. We will make sure of it." I felt something break open inside my chest, a combination of relief and profound loss, gratitude, and devastating heartbreak. This was the part I'd known was coming, but knowing and accepting are different things. I'd brought James to safety, but in doing so, I was saying goodbye. I was releasing him back into the world, back into the war, back into a future that didn't include me. "He's in the cart," I said quietly, hidden beneath the false bottom. "My father built it years ago." Michel nodded, his expression never changing. He was all business, all efficiency. "We'll need 30 minutes. Can you keep watch? Make sure no patrols come by?" "Yes," I said, though my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone braver than I felt. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, I went to the cellar one last time. James was waiting for me, sitting on the edge of a wooden crate, his leg wrapped tightly, his face grim with the knowledge of what was to come. He'd spent the last hours preparing himself mentally for the journey ahead, for the months of hiding and moving through the darkness that would follow. When he saw me, he stood, painfully, carefully, and pulled me into his arms. I let myself believe for just a moment that there was another version of this story, another world where we weren't divided by war and circumstance, where we could have a future together that didn't involve separation and loss. But the moment passed, as all moments do, and I was left with the reality of goodbye. "Go," I whispered, my voice breaking despite my efforts to maintain composure. "Please, before I beg you to stay, before I ask you to hide forever, before I make this harder than it already is, I'll come back for you," he promised, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. "After the war, when all of this is over, I swear it on my life, Margaret. I will come back for you. I will find you. That's a promise I intend to keep." I didn't believe him. Not entirely. How could I? War was a liar, and promises made in cellars were written in smoke and wishes. But I held on to the words anyway, the way a drowning person holds on to driftwood in a vast and uncaring ocean. Michel arrived at midnight, moving with efficient silence through the house. James gave my hand one final squeeze, and then he was gone, melting into the darkness like a ghost, like a dream I was waking from. I stood in the doorway and watched until I couldn't see him anymore, until the darkness had swallowed him completely, until there was nothing left but the memory of his touch, and the ache in my chest. 3 weeks passed after James disappeared into the resistance network. 3 weeks of returning to my ordinary life, of tending the farm, of helping my mother with the endless chores that kept us alive, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Everything was tainted with the memory of those 3 days, colored by the knowledge of what I'd done, marked by the constant fear that someone would discover our secret. The Germans intensified their patrols after the pilot's escape. They seemed to know that someone had helped him, that there was an active network operating in the region. Officers came to the farm multiple times, asking questions, searching outbuildings, watching us with suspicion that dripped like poison from their eyes. But they found nothing. They suspected everything, but they proved nothing. Then one morning, as I was working in the garden, a car pulled up to the house. It was different from the usual patrol vehicles. Sleeker, more official. 2 men in Gestapo uniforms emerged, their faces bearing the cold efficiency of professional interrogators. My mother came to stand beside me, and I felt her hand slip into mine, squeezing once in a gesture of solidarity and terror combined. "Margaret Beaumont?" one of them asked, though they clearly already knew my name. "Yes," I said, my voice steady despite the way my heart was racing. "I'm Margaret Beaumont. You will come with us," he said. It wasn't a request. The interrogation took place in a converted school building that the Germans had commandeered as a local headquarters. The room was bare except for a table, 2 chairs, and a single window that looked out onto nothing. I was left alone for what felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes. Time becomes distorted when you're afraid, when you're waiting for the worst to happen. When they finally came, there were 3 of them. The first introduced himself as Colonel Hoffman, a tall man with gray eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. "We know someone helped the British pilot escape," he said without preamble. "We have evidence. We have witnesses. The only question now is whether you were involved." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling. "Your father," Hoffman continued, ignoring my denial, "was involved with the resistance before his death. We have files. We have documentation. And now his daughter conveniently aids a British pilot's escape." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. "Do you think we're stupid, Miss Beaumont?" I said nothing. Silence, I'd learned from James, was sometimes the most powerful weapon available to us. "The baker, Claude," Hoffman said, pulling out a photograph. "He's already given us information. He's already named names, identified locations, described the network. He told us everything. So you see, your loyalty to these people is pointless. They've already betrayed you." I didn't believe him, but doubt crept in anyway. What if Claude had been captured? What if he'd broken under interrogation? What if everyone in the network was already compromised? The questions multiplied like rabbits, breeding fear and uncertainty. "I want you to know something," I said quietly, meeting his eyes. "Whatever you think I did, whatever you believe happened, I did it because it was right. Because your side committed atrocities. Because hiding one man from execution is not a crime. It's a moral imperative. And if you kill me for that, then history will remember me as a hero and remember you as a monster." Something flickered in Hoffman's face. Anger, perhaps, or respect. For a moment, I thought I'd made a terrible mistake, that my defiance would seal my fate. But then he stood, and his expression returned to its cold neutrality. "We have no proof," he said finally, his voice flat. "Only suspicions, only theories. If we arrested everyone we suspected, we'd have to arrest half the village. So here's what will happen. You will go home. You will go back to your farm. And you will live with the knowledge that we're watching you. Always. Any further suspicious activity, any hint that you're involved with the resistance, and we will return. And next time, we won't be so diplomatic." I was released as suddenly as I'd been taken. The drive back to the farm felt like resurrection and damnation combined. I was alive, but I was also a marked woman, tagged and monitored, living under a permanent cloud of suspicion. When I walked through the door, my mother collapsed into my arms, and we held each other in the kitchen, both of us shaking, both of us understanding that we'd been given a second chance that we didn't deserve. That night I lay in bed and thought about James. I wondered where he was, whether he was safe, whether he thought of me. I wondered if he'd made it to England, if he was already flying missions again, if he'd forgotten me in the chaos of war. The not knowing was its own special torture. a pain that went deeper than any physical injury. 4 months later, on a winter day when snow lay thick on the fields and icicles hung from the farmhouse eaves like daggers, a letter arrived. It came through the resistance network, passed from hand to hand, crossing channels and checkpoints, arriving finally at Claude's bakery with a false postal mark that identified it as coming from Switzerland. Claude brought it to me personally, his eyes bright with something that might have been hope or might have been the reflected light of snow. The letter was short, written in careful handwriting that I recognized immediately. My dearest Margaret, I write this knowing the dangers of putting anything to paper, knowing that this letter could betray us both, but I needed you to know that I arrived safely in England. I needed you to know that I think of you every day, that I carry the memory of those 3 days in my cellar like a sacred thing. I'm flying again. I'm doing my part to end this war. But every moment, every mission, I'm fighting for a future where I can come back to you. I don't know when this war will end. I don't know if I'll survive it, but I wanted you to have this proof that I meant what I said, that I will come back for you when it's over. I will find you. I will make you my wife if you'll have me. That's a promise written in blood and hope, and the determination of a man who's found the reason he wants to live. Until then, be safe, be careful, and know that you are loved by someone who sees you not as a woman who harbored a fugitive, but as the bravest, most extraordinary person I've ever met. Yours in all ways, James. I read the letter so many times that the paper began to wear and fade, the words becoming ghostly imprints rather than clear text. I kept it hidden, buried in the false bottom of a wooden box beneath my bed, removing it only in moments of desperate hope, when the fear and loneliness became too much to bear. It was my evidence that he was real, that those 3 days had happened, that there was a future waiting on the other side of this war if I could just survive long enough to reach it. My mother found me reading it one evening. She didn't say anything, just sat beside me and held my hand, understanding without words that I was in love with a man I might never see again, that I'd committed treason for a heart that might not beat for me when the war ended. The months that followed were strange. The Germans remained suspicious but made no move against me. The resistance continued its work, and I became more deeply involved, using my position as a farmer's daughter, someone above suspicion in many ways, to gather intelligence, to pass messages, to help move people along the network. I learned to live in 2 worlds simultaneously, the world of German occupation and the hidden world of resistance and rebellion. By 1944, the tide of war was turning. The Allies were pushing back, liberating territory, advancing toward France. The Germans grew more desperate, more brutal. The interrogations intensified. People disappeared. The village learned to live with the weight of fear that pressed down on us like a physical force. But we also learned to live with hope. Fragile hope. Tentative hope. But hope nonetheless that liberation was coming. I thought of James constantly during this period. I wondered if he was part of the offensive. I wondered if he was somewhere over France right now, flying through enemy fire, risking his life to free us from occupation. The thought both comforted and terrified me. June 1944 came like thunder rolling across the sky. The Allies landed on the Normandy beaches, and within weeks, the Germans realized that the war was lost. The occupation that had seemed permanent suddenly became fragile, like ice melting in spring. The soldiers who had looked so invincible began to look desperate, afraid. The power dynamic shifted beneath our feet. The resistance emerged from the shadows, and I emerged with them. I'd spent 2 years working in secret, and now I could finally fight openly. We sabotaged German supply lines. We harassed retreating troops. We helped French prisoners escape. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. One August morning, as the German forces were pulling out of our region, a German officer came to the farm. It was Hoffman, the man who'd interrogated me. He looked diminished somehow, his uniform disheveled, his face bearing the weight of a man who'd backed the losing side of history. "I'm leaving," he said, without preamble, "before the Americans arrive. But I wanted to tell you something, Miss Beaumont. I've thought about our conversation for 2 years, about what you said, that you acted out of moral imperative." He paused, his gray eyes reflecting something almost like shame. "You were right. We were wrong. And I wanted you to know that before I disappeared, before history judges me." I didn't respond. Some words don't deserve a reply, and some confessions come too late to matter. But I watched him leave, and I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a recognition that even those we consider our enemies are often simply broken people serving broken systems. The Americans arrived 3 days later, and the village erupted in celebration. Flags were produced from hiding places. Church bells rang for the first time in years. People danced in the streets, their faces streaming with tears of joy and release. The occupation was over. France was free, but I couldn't celebrate. I was searching faces in the crowd, looking for one specific person, hoping against hope that James would somehow appear in the chaos of liberation. I'd built this hope over 2 years, and now that the war was ending, I needed to know if he'd survived it. The months after liberation were strange and disorienting. The Germans were gone, but the scars of occupation remained. The village had to rebuild. We had to figure out how to live as free people again, how to exist in a world where we weren't constantly looking over our shoulders. I wrote to the RAF, giving them James's name and asking for information about his survival. The responses were slow and vague. He'd survived his tour of duty, they said. He was alive, as far as they knew. But personal information was restricted. I couldn't know more than that. Months became seasons. Seasons became a year. By 1945, the war in Europe was over, and by August, Japan had surrendered. The entire world had changed, and yet I was frozen in place, waiting for a man who'd promised to return and who might never actually come. My mother urged me to move on, to accept that sometimes promises made in war don't survive the peace, but I couldn't. I'd risked everything for James, my safety, my future, my very life. I wasn't going to simply forget him, because the war had ended. Then one day in September 1945, a letter arrived from England. This one came through official channels, addressed to me personally, bearing a real British postal mark. My hands shook as I opened it. Dear Miss Beaumont, Wing Commander James Whitmore has asked me to contact you on his behalf. He is still recovering from injuries sustained in the final months of the war, but is expected to make a full recovery. He was shot down over Germany in March and spent the remainder of the war as a POW. He was liberated with the Russian advance and has only recently been able to communicate. He wishes you to know that he survived the war. He survived his imprisonment, and when he is well enough to travel, he intends to keep his promise to return to France and find you. Respectfully, RAF Command. I read those words and felt something inside me fracture and reform, like a broken bone healing stronger than before. He was alive. He'd survived. He was coming back. For the first time since pulling him from that burning plane, I allowed myself to believe in a future beyond the war, beyond the occupation, beyond survival. I allowed myself to dream about what might come next. It was October 1945 when I first saw him again, though I didn't recognize him at first. The man who stepped off the train at the station was not the man I'd hidden in my cellar. He was thinner, bearing the marks of suffering that war imprints on those who survive it. His left arm was in a sling, and he walked with a limp that hadn't been there before. But his eyes, those impossible blue eyes, were the same. When he saw me, standing at the edge of the platform, in a dress I'd sewn specifically for this moment, something transformed in his face. It was like watching someone come back to life, like watching grief transform into joy in the space of a heartbeat. He walked toward me, slowly because of his injuries, and I walked toward him. We met in the middle of the platform, and for a long moment, we simply stood there, looking at each other, both of us afraid that if we spoke, we would break the spell. You came back, I whispered finally. I promised, he said, and his voice was the same voice that had whispered my name in the darkness of my cellar. I told you I would. He kissed me then, there on the platform with half the village watching, with tears streaming down both our faces, with all the weight of 2 years of waiting and hoping and surviving crushing down on us. It was a kiss that tasted like redemption, like survival, like the promise of a future that we'd fought for and earned. I have nothing, he said when he pulled back. I'm still recovering. I don't have a job yet, and my arm might never work properly again. But I have my life, and I have you, and that's more than I thought I'd have when I was lying in that German POW camp. Will you marry me, Margaret? Will you take a broken man and make a life with him? If this story moved you, if it showed you the power of love and courage in the darkest times, please hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment below telling me what moment touched your heart the most. I read every single comment, and your words matter to me. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I'd already committed my life to him when I pulled him from that burning plane. I'd already pledged myself to him in that cellar. This was simply the formalization of promises already made, the public declaration of a bond that had been forged in fire and tempered by war. We married in the village church 3 months later, in the same church where my father had married my mother, in a ceremony that felt like a celebration, not just of our love, but of survival itself. My mother cried throughout the entire service. Claude was there, the baker who'd helped orchestrate James's escape. The entire village was there, bearing witness to the love story that had grown out of the war's darkness. In the years that followed, we built a life together. James worked with the British mission in France for a time, then eventually moved back to Yorkshire with me, where we had children and grandchildren. We told the story of his escape to our children, and they told it to theirs. A family legend born from courage and love and the terrible necessity of choosing the right thing even when it could cost us everything. But the most important part of the story, the part that James always emphasized when he told it, wasn't about the danger or the escape or even the war itself. It was about a moment in a cellar when two people from opposite sides of a conflict chose to see each other's humanity instead of their nationality. It was about the extraordinary power of one person choosing to help another, choosing to risk everything for a stranger who would become everything. The war taught me that we're often called to make choices that define who we are as people. Those choices might seem small at the moment. Help one person, hide one fugitive, commit one act of rebellion. But those small choices ripple outward, creating consequences and possibilities that we can never fully predict or understand. Colonel Hoffman taught me that redemption is possible, even for those on the wrong side of history, though it often comes too late to undo the damage we've caused. He survived the war and wrote a book of memoirs that became an important historical document. In those memoirs, he wrote about me, about the young French woman who'd shown him what true courage looked like, who'd made him question the system he served, who'd changed his understanding of morality forever. And James taught me that promises matter, that love isn't something that requires perfect circumstances or ideal timing, that sometimes the most ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things, and that when we answer that call, we become something more than ourselves. The cellar where James hid for 3 days was eventually turned into a memorial, one of thousands across Europe dedicated to those who resisted Nazi occupation, who harbored refugees, who chose conscience over convenience. Visitors come from all over the world now to see the small room with its shelves of preserves and its pile of old blankets, trying to imagine what it must have been like. What courage must have driven a young woman to commit such an act of rebellion. But it wasn't courage, exactly. It was love in its purest form. Love for a stranger, love for humanity, love for the possibility of a better world. It was the recognition that we're all connected, that suffering recognizes suffering, that compassion is the highest calling we can answer. I'm an old woman now, and James is old beside me. We've lived a full life together, filled with ordinary joys and ordinary sorrows. But I've never forgotten that cellar. I've never forgotten the choice I made on that October day, when I heard a plane crash and chose to act instead of turning away. That choice saved a man's life. That man became my husband. That marriage produced a family that has spread across the world, carrying with them the knowledge that one person can make a difference, that ordinary people can be heroes, that love, true, selfless love, is the most powerful force in the universe. If you're watching this story, if you followed James and Margaret on this journey through war and danger and redemption, I hope you take something from it. I hope you understand that you have more power than you know, that your choices matter more than you think, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is help someone, even when helping costs us everything. The war is long over now. The people who lived through it are aging and passing away. But the lessons we learned about courage, about compassion, about the power of choosing love over fear, those lessons are eternal. They transcend time and geography and circumstance. As Margaret used to say to James, even in the darkest moments, you're going to survive this. We're going to survive. Together. Because survival isn't really about living through the war. It's about living with hope, even when hope seems impossible. It's about holding on to the belief that there will be a future worth living for, and then doing whatever it takes to ensure that future comes to pass. That's the legacy of those 3 days in the cellar. That's the promise that James kept. That's the love that outlasted the war and shaped the world that came after.